Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Neal, and I'm a therapist who has run an encounter group for the past 4 weeks. Um, the encounter group it was decided that this would be the structure we would use for a study about disordered eating. So for the past 4 weeks, I've met with a group of participants. There have been 10 participants. We've met twice a week for 2-hour sessions each time, and it's been a really wonderful experience. So I thought I would share a little bit with you. A lot of people think that encounter groups are a thing of the past, and they aren't really used as much today as the more contemporary group therapy structure, as a contemporary group therapy structure, more like process groups and current support groups. So what makes encounter groups a little bit different is there's a built-in amount of time usually associated there. So it's for a set number of weeks or a set number of sessions. Sometimes they're just one session. So for the purposes of our study, it was decided that this would be a great opportunity to create an encounter group about disordered eating. So just to give a little bit of background about what an encounter group is. So in the late 40s, in about 1946, Connecticut, the state passed the Fair Employment Practices Act, and this changed the way that companies would be able to hire, or the limitations that they would have to be willing to hire people of all different races and backgrounds. And so they called in Kurt Lewin, who was a prominent social psychologist at the time, to facilitate groups to discuss the racial tensions that were mounting during this, while everyone got used to the idea they'd be working with people they formerly didn't have to work with. And what started to happen was that Lewin and a bunch of colleagues, the people he had been training to run these groups, started to realize that there was a lot of benefit to be gained by having people sitting in a group and discussing these things openly. And then what started to happen was participants became aware that the different leaders were discussing what had happened in the groups later at night. So they had evening meetings. And what ended up happening was that as participants became aware of this, some of them started to request to be part of these meetings. And Kurt Lewin and the other therapists decided, or psychologists decided, that they would allow the participants to sit in on this. And what they found was that the participants got a lot of benefit from being able to see what they had been discussing openly discussed again, and to have their behaviors and insights kind of reflected back to them. And so these became known as kind of the first, or this became known as the kind of the first experiential group model. Um, and this formed the basis for what were called T groups, or training groups. And this was more focused on research purposes and educational purposes, to have people experience an interpersonal dynamic in which they could discuss things openly, like social issues or their own issues, and see what would come up. As time went on, Lewin developed a few different factors that were important in this group dynamic. There was feedback, which he borrowed from engineering. I believe he worked for MIT. There was feedback, observant participation, unfreezing, he called it, and cognitive aids. And the idea of unfreezing was that by discussing certain problems and certain issues openly, that people would get a better sense of, or be able to change their belief system a little bit to reflect their experience in the group. And with cognitive aids, that has more to do with providing people some information that could maybe change their beliefs or get them talking about different subjects that they were discussing in group. So with encounter groups, they tend to have a very strong psychoeducational element too, depending on the group. And this also goes back to the idea that it's not a general process group, and that there is a built-in amount of time. So for our group that involved disordered eating, the criteria was that the participants had to be over 18 years of age. They had to be independent, and they had to not be diagnosed with any formal disorder, a personality disorder or eating disorder, but they had to have the belief or the perception that they engaged in disordered eating. And so this would kind of be a unifying factor and would kind of create built-in cohesion as the group started. So to go along with this psychoeducational element that I was trying to integrate with the group, one of the prompts, I would start some of the sessions with a prompt. And so one of the prompts that I started a little later in the session, in one of the later sessions, was the prompt, what did you eat for dinner last night? And just by using that prompt, it got people talking very concretely about what they had eaten, and they made discoveries as they were talking about things that they weren't even aware of that they had eaten, or other people were able to recognize changes in their body language as they talked about the food. And changes in their tone of voice, and so this is really helpful. The idea also behind what became known as encounter groups in the 60s, and this was something that Carl Rogers came up with as a term to promote the idea that it was a neutral setting and an experience that could help people. Um, so one of the things that came up with encounter groups was people decided that they would think about it, or it became known as group therapy for normals, and normals just meaning that they weren't in crisis and they weren't dealing with any particular disorder that they had been diagnosed with. And this gave way to the idea that everybody can benefit from a group dynamic and an interpersonal situation in which people are supported and can feel the safety of an environment where they can be themselves among people and get constructive feedback. Um, so one of the other things that I did in our group was I started a group with a handout that talked about different eating disorders and what they meant. And so this gave a little bit of academic information to the participants that would allow them to try to diagnose themselves if they wanted to. But it was really just to get the group going in that direction and see what people's beliefs were about what eating disorders really are and what the different types are. So this was another educational element. So the goal of our group wasn't explicit. It was really to help people grow as far as learning about themselves. And this is a very important part of most encounter group situations, as they were, especially in the 60s and 70s, which was considered their heyday. The idea was that anybody could gain knowledge about themselves from this. And one writer and encounter group leader, Vincent O'Connell, wrote that the encounter group helps to dissolve desensitizations. So this is the ways that the outside world tells us we have to behave and how we react. So it desensitizes us to our authentic self and encourages us to suppress parts of ourself that we find unappealing. So by being in an encounter group, the group tends to, or ends up giving people the license to be themselves, and in doing such, it puts you more, as he says, in direct correspondence with your body, and it helps you become more in tune with your body as well. And because it becomes not just about sitting in a group of people and just existing, it becomes about the engagement factor and feeling safe and supported. And just by virtue of having that safety to be an authentic version of yourself in a group for any amount of time, it puts you more in touch with your body. And so for our last session, what I did was, with what was similar with Lewin and his colleagues back in the 40s, which is kind of what started this whole trend. In our last session, I encouraged all participants to discuss their experience of being in the encounter group openly. So to talk about what the effects they believe the effect they believe it had on them as a participant, and what they thought, how they thought I did as far as being a leader. And Yalom, who was a prominent psychologist who studied encounter groups and did studies of his own, talked about the different leader roles that would be most associated with benefit having been achieved by participants. And he said that the four most important were emotional activation, executive function, caring, and meaning attribution. Now, the first two, emotional activation and executive function, you have to try to maintain that at a moderate level. If you encourage an overly emotional activation, then there tends to be more hostility that's expressed, and it doesn't end up facilitating growth. And this was a problem a lot of psychologists had with encounter groups in the 60s and 70s, who had the mentality of whatever you feel, just let it out, get as angry as you want, and because we're all normal, we'll be able to deal with it. Well, this actually turned out to be very detrimental most of the time, because uh, there wasn't enough acknowledgement of the ways in which people were causing detriment to each other by virtue of of indulging a lot of anger and hostility, and this would not facilitate growth. And then the executive function also has to be moderate because you don't want to be overly controlling as a leader, especially in an encounter group situation where everybody feels like they're about on the same level. That's kind of the purpose of it. So the idea of caring and meaning attribution are high on the priority list for an encounter group leader. To support this idea that you are, at least for this set of circumstances and the amount of time that you'll be in the group, that you all care about each other and want to facilitate each other's growth and development. And meaning attribution, that when somebody says something that seems to have particular importance or significance to them or someone else, that you can acknowledge that. So I want to thank everybody for watching today. I had a wonderful experience facilitating this encounter group, and I believe, based on the feedback that we all gave to each other in the last session, that people really got a lot of benefit from it and learned about themselves. So I believe encounter groups are actually a great way that you can gain some educational benefit, like learn things educationally, and also learn about yourself under a set amount of time in a set circumstance. And that the idea that we had an overarching theme for ours, which was disordered eating, only helped to facilitate greater cohesion amongst the group members and give everybody something to focus on for an enriching experience themselves.